Good afternoon. This afternoon, we're going to do a look-see at President and General Ulysses S. Grant. He was our 18th president. He went to West Point. His father contacted their congressman in Ohio for an appointment, and when he was 17, he showed up at West Point, the Army's academy. He was still growing. He was only around 5'3", but by the time he graduated, he was a little over 5'6", but he was short for presidents. He was also not a scholar, but he was very good with horses and could easily have been and made his life as a horseman. But he went into the Army and he made a success of it in the initial attempt. He was in and out twice. His being from Ohio, he was one of 7 presidents from Ohio. And there was a reason for that. After the Civil War, you couldn't get elected if you were a Democrat. We called it waving the bloody shirt. And so one Republican after another was elected. Only one that you can think of wasn't, and that's Grover Cleveland. But otherwise, you move towards the 20th century with Republicans. And many of them were quite good. So it was that Grant had his start at West Point. We often refer to that as Hudson High when we're being negative. It's actually a first-rate academy. He did reasonably well. One of his better friends was named Longstreet. And that's quite amazing because Longstreet became a leading Confederate general in the war to come. Longstreet had a very bumpy career. He was at Gettysburg, was involved in Pickett's charge. When the war was over, Longstreet agreed with the Reconstructionists and settled on their cause, and therefore he lost sympathy in the South and was thought by many Southerners as a traitor. But he was thought by the Union as a person who had reconstructed himself, and so he was favorably viewed, and he ended his career as the American ambassador to Turkey, to the court of the Sultan in Istanbul. But that wasn't the fate that was waiting for our man Grant. So when Grant graduated from West Point, he was ordered to various locations for his assignment, but then he was ordered to take his unit to the rowdy, almost impossible state of California. Reckless, rowdy, somewhat ruthless. And this is because gold has been found and everyone is going gold crazy and people are doing bad things. So the Army is sent in. Grant goes down. He's now on the East Coast, so he has to go down to Panama and cross at the isthmus, the narrowest point. There is no canal, so you go across. And while going across, his party comes down with cholera. And then there's no one who wants to take care of the sick. And so the typical Grant comes forward and he takes care of and nurses the sick people who have cholera and gets them out to the other side of Panama and then gets the whole group that's left up to Rowdy, California. There he goes and makes himself first at a camp called Camp Humboldt. Humboldt's a very famous name for Germans. Humboldt University is one of the great universities of Germany. Its main building is right on the Unter den Linden in Berlin. The Humboldt brothers were scientists, and Humboldt actually discovered the currents that work off of the California coast that bring those icy cold waters, as opposed to the East Coast, which gets the warm waters of the Gulf Stream. That's why you can swim in just a swimming suit and the great beaches of the East, whereas you need a rubberized suit to even think about putting one toe into the Pacific along the California, Washington, Oregon coast. So it was that you have now Grant at Humboldt, and he is working under a senior captain who he's already had a run-in with. And unfortunately, Grant, he's been married and he loves making babies, so he's already made 4. And his wife, who was pregnant with the last one, had to stay in New York, so she didn't get to go to Panama, get cured of cholera and go up to California. She had to stay. So it was that Grant was, in fact, introduced to alcohol. He was lonely, so he took to the bottle, and it became a lifelong problem for him, drinking in excess. And so it was the captain in charge threatened him. So he agreed if he could give up alcohol, he'd stay, and if he couldn't, he would resign. So it was, he couldn't, and he resigned as promised. Then he went back to civil life. Well, he was a disaster in his civilian career, and he tried many things, farming. He could have gone back to his family business, but he didn't want to do that. And so it was, things got worse, and then someone trying to be nice to him gave him a slave. If you can imagine giving a human being to another human being. And Grant was opposed to slavery, and so he freed the slave, mammurized him, and therefore rid himself of this. Now you have to realize that in the Grant family, his wife was a lifelong Democrat. Nevertheless, they did not let politics divide them, just like the Lincolns had not divided, even though she came from a Democratic family that was sympathetic to the Confederacy. Now you have this man has this very strange name, and when he got to West Point, even before he was married, his fellow cadets decided that they would use one of his 4 names and call him by that, and he was known to everybody as Sam. And I like that better because it makes him sound very human and very down to earth. Because to the other cadets, and to me also, the only people named Ulysses are ancient Greeks. And so instead, now you have Sam, friendly, making friends like Longstreet, or later to be Confederate leaders. And he knows who he is and where he is, but he just can't seem to make a success of civilian life. And now he's drinking too much. But the war comes. He becomes a serious military leader. He had already practiced the art of the military because while in service the first time, he had fought in the Mexican War. He, Lee, Longstreet, and others got their training for real military action in the Mexican War. But it's interesting to know that Grant thought the war was a bad war, and it was bad on our part, that we had attacked a weaker nation and that we have robbed them of land. So Grant did not approve of President Polk's war, but approve or not, it was fought, we won, we signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo onto the Mexicans, and they gave up the American Southwest, to include, of course, that funny state that's going to cause so much trouble once gold is found, California. And we'd already ripped off Texas, where we were going to plan to turn it into 10 little Confederate states so that we could let one of them in, and then we let it a free state in. This was always to solve the question of not breaking up the Union over something called slavery. You let a slave state in, then you let a free state in, and therefore there's a balance always in the Congress. As you know, this balance did not work out. So Grant, who like Lincoln himself, in his politics, Grant had been a Whig, but a Northern Whig. The Whig Party was divided in its heyday into two branches: conscious Whigs, who felt they had a conscience over the issue of slavery and they didn't like it. They didn't like slavery. And then there were cotton Whigs, and these were the Whigs of the South, mainly small business people in the towns and cities of the South were cotton Whigs. But the Whig solution was not a solution for the long run, and the Whig Party disappears. And now you're stuck with this new thing, the Republican Party. And Lincoln becomes then the leader of that party. 4 people run for the presidency in 1860. Lincoln is the majority winner, but a minority president. But he becomes president. And there you have it. He goes looking for a general. He asks Robert E. Lee to be the commander of Northern forces. But Lee felt his loyalty was to the home state of Virginia, and so he went south. And then Lincoln had his terrible time trying to find a leader who could win a war. And he finally found them with Grant. But he was warned before he chose Grant that the man drinks. And Lincoln, in his wonderful wry way, said, well, find out what it is he drinks, and I'll send a case of it to each one of my generals to see if they can win a battle, because that Grant could do. And so the great struggle takes place, the struggle particularly between the Army of the Potomac, which is the Northern Army facing Richmond, and the Army of Northern Virginia, which is the Confederate Army facing Washington. And these two armies clash many times, Lee always winning. And then comes the long clash once Grant takes over, as Grant and Lee jostle their way down the Virginia areas so that they could come up against Richmond up through the Tidewater area of Virginia. And to not redo this war for you, let us say that at a stillness at Appomattox, the war came to an end and the Confederacy lost. And then you have this long period of Reconstruction, and you have the terrible problems that come with Reconstruction. But Grant has a life. Grant decides to split with Johnson, who is the vice president, who becomes president once Lincoln is assassinated. And Grant does, in fact, agree with much of the Reconstruction period. He felt very badly for the blacks. He felt very badly for the American Indians. He was on the side of those who had lost in most of the struggles so far, and he tried to right it for them as best he could. But things go on, and finally then the Republican Party decides it will in fact choose Grant. Now just Ulysses S. Grant, or Sam as he's known to his friends, as president of the United States. And so he becomes the president. He works very, very hard at many things, but his problems are immense because starting with a really very tricky and unreliable and most difficult president, that was Andrew Jackson, many, many decades before Grant is in the White House, you had the beginning of an increasing spoil system. And the spoil system, by the time Grant is taken over, and he's not a political animal, so he doesn't know what to do about it. So within a matter of years, 4 members of the cabinet that Grant has put together are now fired or thrown out of office because they're crooks. So it's a major problem because it's now rampant throughout the administration. And Grant is sitting on top of a rotten, rotten government. He tried to have civil service reform. He got a commission, but the problem is it had no power. And it wasn't until after Grant is gone that finally Senator Pendleton in the Senate introduces a measure that becomes the Pendleton Act. And the Pendleton Act actually gives teeth to the civil service reform. And so suddenly now, you don't just give jobs in government to your friends. There is a series and battery of tests that you have to take. There are ranks that you can fill. They go from GS1 to GS18. And these are general service ranks. And in the Foreign Service, they have their own. In the Diplomatic Corps, that's FSF01, SFO, all the way up to Career Ambassador. And for each one of these, either GS or FSO ranks, you get an efficiency report regularly, not just once in a lifetime, but quite regularly, in order to get a promotion. And so it was that the system slowly begins to correct itself. But while Grant is there, he has several problems. He's continued his heavy drinking. There is a wonderful hotel that I often go to, that if you go out the White House facing towards the National Theater and up, not Pennsylvania Avenue, but Constitution Avenue, there is a hotel that's there in the days of Grant. And he used to go over there for his afternoon drink. And when he arrived in the hotel, he'd look around and see all these people sitting around waiting to see him. And he called them by a word that is now common in Washington. He called them, my lobbyists are here, my lobbyists. And they were the first lobbies. Today, there's a whole street full of them called K Street. As the great Harry Truman once said, when you come to Washington, and if you want a friend, get a dog. Don't hang out with these lobby people who are there to sell their souls in order to get these contracts today, immense contracts for Boeing Company, contracts for certain Silicon Valley companies, the lobbyists. And so it is that Grant has this problem and he's not good at solving it. And so he's a failure as president, basically because he's surrounded by crooks. So what to do? Well, he tries at hand at other things. He does run again, and he does win again. So he's president twice. He hopes to be able to work some miracles. He decides that the West needs a big park. It so happens, of course, as I've yelled at you before, that the West was never, in fact, the East nor the West, neither were empty. There are Indians there. And the Indians have now we've moved them out west. And it was Lewis and Clark under Jefferson who went all the way out down the Columbia River, all the way to the Pacific, and looking at the territory that we had legally, not forcefully, but legally bought from Napoleon, the Louisiana Territory. And one of the places they went was a place that the Indians told them that the earth bubbled up and occasionally came up in streams of water. Now we call that Yellowstone today. And we have these famous geysers there. And we do have mud that does bubble. But there was no park then. There was no park when the Indians knew it for thousands of years. There was no park when Lewis and Clark. But Grant decided to make Yellowstone into a park. So that's one of his great achievements, that he gives to generations to come this marvelous, wonderful park full of grizzly bears, mountain lions, Old Faithful. It's a beautiful, beautiful park. If you have not been there, you should be there. And when you go there, you should thank Sam Grant for this great gift. He also was bitten with the bug of colonial power, and for some odd reason, he decided he would take the Dominican Republic. But the Congress was not in favor of these takings, and so they refused to be involved in it. So Dom Rep, as it later called, when we do invade, does not become part of the United States in its holdings abroad. We'll leave that for McKinley and his government and the war with Spain and the gaining of Puerto Rico and the Philippines. But under Grant, we do not take over the Dominican Republic, to our good sense in the Congress. But we do get Yellowstone, and we get everything that Grant can work with without having to work with this awful government full of spoil systems. And so it is that he changes things where he can. He appoints good people where he can. But unfortunately, many of them were tainted with the idea that they could get something out of this business. So it is that Grant comes to his end of his 8 terms. So he decides to see the world that he's never seen. So he takes a round the world trip. And when he comes back, he thinks for a while and he says, I think I'll run for president again. So it wasn't Franklin Delano Roosevelt who had the idea of breaking the old tradition. Grant himself wanted to, but his own party was now tired of him and they refused to nominate him. So he didn't run again, but he did see the world. And when he got back, he realized he didn't have any money. He'd never had any money, and he still didn't have any money. So he decides, I'll write my memoirs and I'll sell them and make enough money to support my wife and my children. Since in those days, the presidents didn't get a retirement fund. They got what they got while they were in office, and then it was over. And there was no Social Security and none of those things that come with the progressive presidents or come later with the New Deal presidents. So he was effectively broke. So he did begin writing his memoirs. And he had to do that in order to support his wife, who was still alive. So it is that his doctors then declare that the problem that he has physically is that he has cancer. He has cancer of the jaw and of the throat, and it is going to kill him. And it's very painful. Nevertheless, he works and finishes what is a basic American masterpiece, the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. In fact, for historians, there are only 2 pieces that reach to that height. One, of course, was written in the time of the Roman Republic, when Caesar finished his campaigns in what is today France and was in Gaul. He wrote his famous work, The Gallic War. Start in that famous paragraph, Gallia est divisa in tres partes, in unum partem Belgum. And it is today considered one of the great gems of Western civilization. It tells the story of the growth of the Roman Republic all the way into Transalpine Gaul and then into the heartland of the French people today. Well, so it is with Grant's memoirs. And they were a hit in his lifetime. They didn't make the money that was needed so that Mrs. Grant would not die in poverty. And so it was that you have this great man who's going to pass from the scene, was in fact a notable character in the Civil War and before, was notable as earlier as the terrible times in California with the gold rush and the rowdiness of the crowds. It's hard to remember that we were not the California you know today. We were rough, tough people who had poured into this state basically to make a fortune. We were later to pour north into Alaska to make another fortune because gold was discovered in Alaska, which had just been bought by Lincoln's administration because Secretary of State Seward was offered a good deal and he took it. And then Alaska became our property, later to become a state and later to become a scene for much of the gold rush. Some of you might have seen, it's a very bad movie now because Chaplin chopped it all up by trying to turn it into a sound film. But The Gold Rush by Charlie Chaplin tries to give you a feeling for this time in film terms. For Grant, there's never been a film that you can turn to with any sort of sense of reliability, nor a great piece of music. It was basically a time of expansion. It was a time of growth. But there were lots of people who were suffering. And it was interesting that the man who saw and sympathized with this suffering, particularly the American Indians, when Grant was in California without his wife, he did travel about from his fort at Humboldt, and he saw how the Indians were being cheated by the Californians and how badly they were being treated by the Californians. And so it was that he had this sympathetic ear for the less fortunate because he had known what it was to be poor. When he did get out of the army, he was a failure. He did not make it in civilian life. And when he came back to the army, he was a great success. And of course, first in the Mexican War, then later in the Civil War. If something he's remembered for is not so much his long and extended battles with Lee across the Virginia landscape, was the great campaign at Vicksburg. Vicksburg was the bastion on the Mississippi, and he who controlled it controlled the Mississippi, and the Confederates controlled it. And so it was Grant, in his very clever way. He understood that breaking the Confederate hold would not be easy. And so what he did was what they had done on the East Coast also. There was an incredible attempt to build an ironclad ship. In the case of the one in the East, it was in Virginia, it was the Monitor and the Merrimack, and the great campaign they had off the Virginia Capes and into the Chesapeake Bay itself, the Monitor and the Merrimack. And Grant, is going to see to it that a ship is built that has metal sides to it. Now, you must understand that when we write American history, we think we did everything first and everything best, but it's not true. The Koreans had built a metal ship. They still have it. It's near their harbor at Busan, now pronounced Busan with a B instead of a P. And this was a very famous warship that defeated Hideyoshi, the shogun who was trying to invade Korea again. So not only did the Koreans invent metal type before the Germans, they did the metal ship before the Americans. Very, very slippery, those Koreans, getting ahead of everybody. But it was that a metal ship was in fact able to run in front of the guns, which are high up at Vicksburg, and run the gamut and survive. And that ship, by the way, is quite wonderful And it survives, and it's still there at Vicksburg. I've taken many a tour of that particular site. And when you go there, you can go on the metal ship. You can see where it was built. You can see where it was placed, where it could not be destroyed by the Confederates until it was finally used. It's a major piece of engineering on the part of the Union and the Union Army that is commanded by Grant, General Grant. So whether he drank too much or not, he knew how to get a metal ship onto the Mississippi and run in front of the guns and finally get behind the fortifications and take Vicksburg, which is the great battle in the West. Because the Civil War is won basically between two great forces. The forces that take Vicksburg from the Confederates and the forces that take at Gettysburg, the battle at Gettysburg, and then the war is over. And the great man himself, Lincoln, gets to make his famous address, the Gettysburg Address. And in no time, we're moving towards the end of the war and the famous meeting, that stillness, as it's called in the famous book, Stillness at Appomattox, where Grant, again, always understanding the position of those who lose, is very generous in his terms. There's no intention of hanging Robert E. Lee. There's no intention of incarcerating everybody. The only time that anybody, as I've told you before, is in fact executed is the man who ran the prisoner of war camp in Georgia. And that man was in fact executed because he ran a terrible camp in which the POWs, if you call them that, those who had been captured and lived, most people didn't get to live. They were badly wounded and they died of their wounds. They were operated on and they died of the operation. More people died in the American Civil War than died in any other war the Americans fought. And Grant knew that, and Grant was generous in his terms to Lee and to Lee's army. They were allowed to take their rifles. They might need those for hunting. You have to remember that the South was basically an agrarian society that lived off shooting things like wild turkeys, rabbits, squirrels, anything you could get in a stew pot. And they were taught by the Indians they later killed how both to fish the rivers and the bays and how to find those strange things called clams and oysters, a world known to the Indians, shared by the Indians, and then taken from the Indians. And Grant was aware of these things, these terrible things that had happened. And so it is he hoped, the idea of Reconstruction into something positive. Of course, it didn't end up positive. The scallywags and others who came south, the Ku Klux Klan and its reaction to all of this, seen best in that notorious film made by W.D. Griffith called The Birth of a Nation. All that was to follow, but that wasn't Grant's fault. Grant was dead by the time Birth of the Nation came around. There was for many years a famous joke on radio and television. It was sort of stupid. It was always a question, who's buried in Grant's tomb? Well, of course, Grant is buried in Grant's tomb. Who else would be buried in Grant's tomb? And the tomb is there. You can go to see it. It's not that hard to get to. It's right in New York City, right on the island of Manhattan, the island that the Dutch bought for a couple of strings of beads from the Indians. Grant's tomb, not far from Columbia University, that is. Grant got to see all of that, got to know all of that. He got to write his memoirs. He got to see that it made a goodly amount of money. They were considered a masterpiece even in their day. It gave Mrs. Grant enough money to live on for the rest of her life and to help the children get started. 4 children. Grant loved making children. He loved having a drink. In many ways, he was as open to fun as Lincoln was. Lincoln loved to dance. Who would think the man at Gettysburg was a dancer? George Washington loved to dance. These people were human beings. They weren't little sticks that you moved around. They weren't puppets, and they certainly weren't men carved out of marble. They were human in all their many ways. And certainly Grant was. He'd seen the worst of it, and he wanted to see the best of it. He thought there was the best was still ahead of us, more to build. He made some good decisions. Yellowstone's an excellent decision, giving us one of our first great national parks. The idea of making a colony out of the Dominican Republic was a stupid idea, and the Congress was wise to say no. Running for a 3rd term was not a good idea because they had yet to cure the spoil system. So all Grant would be coming back to is the same rotten system of government in Washington that he had left. It wasn't until the Pendleton Act is passed in the 1890s, and then later, to make the Pendleton Act have more teeth, we passed the Hatch Act in the 20th century to keep these people who are civil servants out of the political arena. They are not to run for certain people. They should not navigate the political system in favor of this one and opposed to that one. If they are civil servants serving the state, they need to be and remain just that. And this issue of civil service reform began to sweep the Western world because it was a problem everywhere. And in Germany, the great German sociologist, Max Weber, began to make it a subject to be studied, particularly what you call the higher civil servants, because those are the jobs you want. You want to be postmaster general so that you can rake off money from the top. If not in Washington, you wanted to be the postmaster in the state. But now you weren't to be that. You were to be the postmaster, but not licking stamps and not taking money out of the till. You were to pass an exam. You were to be part of a general service, and you were to be a civil servant to be admired. And so it was with Max Weber's work of looking at the German higher civil service, which was reformed and was one of the better ones in Europe, and everyone else. Max Weber, of course, creates the modern field of, along with the famous French sociologist, the modern field of sociology. He gives us the famous word, the Protestant work ethic. It does not mean that other people don't work hard. It doesn't mean that Catholics or Buddhists or any other group other than Protestants can't work. It just means that in a group of people who became the Protestant Reformation, there were people who believed that your ability to work and display your hard work in public and to display it in such a way that you postpone pleasure. You didn't take the money and run to Las Vegas and gamble it away. You put it in the bank. You saved money. And these accumulated savings, of course, became the basis of capitalism. Because once the bank had too much money, what it did had to lend it out to people, lend it out to businesses, to individuals who wanted to invest it. And so it was that a long struggle takes place, just as it did in our country, it did in Canada, just as it did in Canada, in Australia, just as it did in Britain, Germany, France. All the modern countries of the world needed a professional civil service, and they got it. but it was a hard, like most cases in America, a hard road to go. Because the easy road was a spoil system where you could, like Andy Jackson did, reward only your friends and throw the others out of office and let your friends walk away with the money. There'd be no more of that. And so it did come to pass that America had a system of government that one could be proud of, but it took doing getting there. And in the meantime, Grant had to live through this time that was not the best of times, the time in which the spoil systems was ruining his government. And he, a man who believed that a man was as good as his word, who believed in honor, was in fact now trapped by a system that only believed in money. Remember, years after Grant, but in another military sense, when Eisenhower became president, and Eisenhower was also a former general, a successor in a great war, World War II, Eisenhower turned to somebody to be Secretary of Defense, Secretary Wilson. And Wilson came, of course, from General Motors. So Wilson's famous mantra was, the business of America is business, meaning that only that the private sector, now I know it's a quite large private sector with many large actors within that private sector, they had primacy of place. And that's not true. We have many people who are most unfortunate. And thank heavens the progressive presidents between 1900 and 1920 recognized that. And certainly the New Deal under FDR and the Fair Deal under Truman recognized that. So then the last great period of reform, the Great Society under LBJ, they recognize there's more to this country than being rich. Some people are very happy in this country not being rich. No, it's always nice to be rich, to have a house, say up in Tahoe for skiing, to have another house up on, say, the Russian River for a summer resort, or just out on the beaches here in California, even though the water is too cold to go in. Yes, it's pleasant, but it isn't the beginning and the end. And Grant seemed to know that. Grant didn't want to make a fortune with his memoirs. He wanted enough money for his wife to live after he passed from this painful, painful death from throat cancer and jaw cancer. It actually ate away his jaw. And so it was that he did pass. But the memory of Grant, certainly in Manhattan, you go by it all the time. It's called Grant's Tomb. You can see it right off the, what is that called? It's not the FDR Drive, that's on the other side of Manhattan. There is a special drive, believe me, that goes by Columbia University and down down the west side. So it is that Grant left his mark. He had been a success. He was a great horseman, could have made his mark with horses. There was a horse at West Point that no one else could handle but Grant. But it was that he made his career as a soldier with leadership of men. I've been to West Point several times. One summer I lectured there. A group of us were lecturing on subjects historical and mainly to deal with our wars. And it's a marvelous place to be. It gives you a feeling of the people that were there in their youth, people who went on to be major figures in our society, many of them still part of memory today. Certainly Eisenhower is remembered. General Bradley is remembered. Even General Patton is remembered. Yeah. So it is, with the Naval Academy is the same. It's quite historical, quite wonderful. Naval Academy is quite funny because one of the founding fathers of the US Navy is John Paul Jones. And John Paul Jones did not like liquor like Grant did. John Paul Jones loved women, and he particularly loved women that he saw in France. What the hell was he doing in France, in their capital of Paris? Well, because he took a warship over to those waters and then played havoc with the British Navy. Remember, we were at war with the Brits, and now we had one or two ships, and we had this guy who was pretty good at blowing up British ships, and then he would come into French harbors, and then he'd take a weekend off and go and have a time of it in Paris with those famous things called French women. In fact, he was buried in Paris. Too many women will kill you. And then he's not only buried there, but centuries later, the midshipmen at Annapolis decide it's not fair for him, he's one of their great leaders, to be buried so far away from America. So they go over there and they dig him up. And they bring poor old John Paul Jones and his bones back to Annapolis, where he used to be a midshipman, and they bury him at Annapolis. So you don't have to go to Paris. You can go to Annapolis to see the midshipman, and you can see the remains of John Paul Jones. They built a very nice monument to him. No one's knocked that one down yet. And it's part of that mystique. And so it is at West Point. I had a West Pointer do a graduate seminar with me once. His name is Jim Sizik. He played football for them. In fact, he had a football scholarship, I think, to the academy. And they have a very famous football game, Army versus Navy. I think it's always played in Philadelphia. And in the process, he got a good grade from me. He was a good student. And he went on to some fame. He got out of the military because he wanted to make money. The same thing that Grant needed to do when he had children and a wife, and Jim had children and a wife and ideas of a career, and he's been very successful. West Point, Hudson High, John Paul Jones, Annapolis. I've even gone to the Air Force Academy. I've not taught there, but I have gone there. And it's quite wonderful in its own way. It's right outside of, between Denver and Fort Carson. And it's very beautiful. It's very modern. Particularly modern is their chapel. And of course, it's in the foothills of the Great Rocky Mountains. So you look up and there's Pikes Peak, snow-capped most of the year, great skiing areas. And then the Air Force Academy, where the Air Force cadets go. It's it's new in the sense that the Air Force was not an Air Force until after World War II. In World War II, it was called the Army Air Corps. And only in 1947, when Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947, did we finally build an independent U.S. Air Force, and then we gave them their own academy out there in Colorado. A great location, particularly if you're a skier. So it was that Grant knew some of this story. He didn't know what happened in the 20th century, but he had a great feel for what had happened in the 19th, and he felt badly about what we had done in the Mexican War. He thought it was an unfair war. He felt badly for how we treated, particularly we, the Californians, the Indians. He was opposed to slavery. He was given a slave, was appalled, and gave the slave his freedom, mammurized him. He was a man for all seasons. We should be lucky to have his type again in a time of need. So it is that I think I'm getting close on to when I'm supposed to stop talking. So I don't want to take any more of your time than necessary. Next time we're going to talk, though, and I want to prep you for that. We have several things coming up, to include a special lecture on the Supreme Court, where I will say something bad about Ginsburg. Since no one said anything bad against her since she died, one has to face the truth that she made some serious errors. Anyway, there'll be a lecture on Ginsburg. On the Supreme Court, Ginsburg being one, we will call it from beginning to end. In other words, from the first court to the court today. And we'll try and cover all the high points and the very low points, because the court has made some really serious errors, which they've gone back and admitted to. Plessy versus Ferguson was the biggest error. That is the error that says separate but equal is good, is okay. And it took Warren, a Republican from California, to go to the court and say, no, it's not, and to eliminate it and change the rule. Unfortunately, we're apparently about to do that on some other issues that could cause us to have a real blow up. But we'll talk about that later. The lecture that's coming is about McKinley. McKinley is, again, you can only have a Republican. Remember, after the Civil War, the Republican Party waves the bloody shirt. So if you served in or was touched by the Civil War, you're in to be president. And McKinley is president, and his vice president is Teddy Roosevelt, much to the objection of Mark Hanna, who is Mr. Republican, who runs the Republican Party from the Senate. Like there is a man from Kentucky today who runs much of the Republican Party from the Senate. And so we'll talk about McKinley, because in McKinley's time, we go off to another aggressive war. It's not bad enough that we have had this war with Mexico, in which we have gone to a land grab to get the entire Southwest, but now we're going to not be happy at home. We will go abroad, and we will have a war with Spain that is drummed up by two awful, awful journalists who own big newspaper chains. One is Pulitzer, and the other is our own man, William Randolph Hearst, of whom there is a great movie called Citizen Hearst. Some people think the greatest movie ever made, an Orson Welles special. But we'll get to talk about those two journalists and the war. And you'll be interested to know that the recent scholarship, particularly the digging up from the bottom of the sea, the ship, the USS Maine, that we claimed the Spanish had blown up, was in fact not blown up by the Spanish at all. It was blown up by the ship itself, meaning our cause célèbre, our cause belli, did not exist. We had no reason to attack Spain, but we did. And then we turned ourselves into the one thing we said we hated. We oppose the colonial imperial system, particularly of the British and French, with their colonies strung all over the world. And now what did we have? The Philippines, which, by the way, did not want us. And we were appalled at them because they were Roman Catholics. By the way, we now have a Roman Catholic Irishman again as President of the United States. Mr. Biden, in the county in Ireland from which his great-great-grandfathers came, is highly celebrating this week the election of another Irishman. Of course, we've had an Irishman before named John Fitzgerald Kennedy. So we will see what happens from that. By the way, if you didn't get a feeling for this election that just went by, Washingtonians knew it was coming. How is that? I'll take the next 5 minutes to explain to you. In Washington, we don't have what the Europeans have. In the British Parliament, in the French National Assembly, there are people that you can recognize as the shadow government. For instance, if that person I think poorly of, who is now the British Prime Minister, were to fall, and Britain should be so lucky that they get rid of him, there would have been, sitting in Parliament, a likely Chancellor of the Exchequer, that's of the Treasury, a likely Foreign Secretary, that's the State Department, and on, all of the major jobs of the opposition party would already be filled by this shadow government, so that it would be very easy to just move over and take over the realms. And the same true if Macron, the current president of the Fifth Republic, who has a prime minister and various members of his cabinet, there are people in Paris who know who the likely replacements would be if Macron were to be thrown out of office. But we don't have that. We just don't have that. So what do we have? Well, we have a shadow government that you just don't know. Because sitting in Washington, D.C., which is this huge capital today, no longer the small little place it used to be on the banks of the Potomac, now a huge city, there are think tanks. For the Democrats, there is the Brookings Institution. For the Republicans, there is the American Enterprise Institute. And if you go over there, or if you work there, if you can get a job there, if you can be one of the leaders there, then you are the likely replacement, because generally speaking, the secretaries and the assistant secretaries and the deputies come from those think tanks into the jobs that are open. For instance, Mr. Biden, this Irish Catholic, I mean, think of what we've got now. We've got an Irish Catholic as president, and a vice president. We have a black woman who's married to a Jewish guy. Oy vey, what a collection. But it's the typical strength of the American system that in its better moments, it picks based on good human and mental qualities. And we have, I think, in this case, and they will find waiting for them in the big law offices around Washington, in the big lobbyist out on K Street, and certainly in these, and these are not the only institutes. I've just named the two biggest and most famous, the Brookings and the American Enterprise Institute, AEI. There are many places to go, to include, of course, in typical fashion for an Irishman, to go amongst the Irish mafia, as Kennedy did, and to go, of course, to their favorite place, which is no less than Harvard. But I hope that the Biden-Harris team would think about going to Berkeley, or going to Yale, or going to the African-American universities right there in Washington, D.C., like Howard, where once upon a time we got one of the greatest Supreme Court justices. Go to where there is quality, goodness of heart, and hard work. All the things that Grant had hoped for and didn't get in his administration. 4 secretaries involved in scandals. They have to go. It's unbelievable. He was not dealt a good hand, but he did the best he could with it. And he ended up writing a masterpiece that has survived him and that allowed his wife to live out her life. So next week, we will be off to colonial empires with McKinley and two horrible journalists. One of them, the Hearst guy, who owned our Chronicle and who built that pile of rocks down there at San Simeon, and where he shacked up with a Hollywood movie star, even though his wife was still living here in the city. What a family. What a group. And they gave us a war, an unjust war. Again, thank you very much and see you next week.